The title of this sermon is Be Real. It's based on John 18:33 through 37, which is our gospel text for Christ the King Sunday. Will you pray with me for a moment, please? Lord, for the sake of all living things, may my words not be trite. For the sake of all living things, may your word be heard. O Lord, our rock and our redeemer, you, not me. Amen. I had heard what my mother said, but I hadn't really listened. This was just a week ago Saturday. Actually, I guess a week ago Friday, when my phone rang at 5:17 in the morning. My mother at this time was a patient at a rehab facility that shall remain nameless. She had been in the hospital, I guess the week before last, week before that now, for pneumonia. And having been in the hospital, she was discharged and went to a rehab facility to regain her strength. But she was only there for 4 days. She left actually against medical advice because she didn't feel safe there. What happened was this, and this was just one of the things that happened, but what happened was this. My mother said she was awakened every morning at 3:30 to be taken from her room to be weighed. Now, my mother was on oxygen at the time, having been treated for pneumonia. And my mother said every time they took her out of the room at 3:30 to weigh her, they always took off the oxygen cannula that she wears and put it on the bed. Well, the first time they did this, my mother said, "Don't I need my oxygen?" And they said, "No, we have other oxygen at the end of the hall that we can use," which never proved to be true. Now, my mother was only without her oxygen for about a minute when they took her down to weigh her. But that Friday morning, the third morning she was there, same thing, she was awakened. Actually, the videotapes from the cameras in the hallway show her being taken down to be weighed at 3:54 a.m. She was only out of her room for a minute, but this time when they brought her back to her room, they did not put her back in bed, and they did not put her oxygen back on her. I don't know how long she was without her oxygen. She was left sitting there beside her bed, and she said she had to get back in bed by herself and find her oxygen for herself. And by the time she did that, by the time she got her cannula back on, she checked her pulse ox, she checked her oxygen saturation percentage, and it was at 70. Anything less than 88 is treatable, and hers was at 70. I heard my mother tell that story for 24 hours, and I even repeated that story, but there was one thing that I didn't really understand. I didn't understand for a full day how my mother was left in the darkness. Because one of the things she said, and I may have heard her say this from the get-go, one of the things she said was that the only way she could find the oxygen tube in the bed was because light from outside the room just barely hit it, just barely gave it enough of a glint for her to find in the darkness. It never really occurred to me, at least for the first 24 hours, how my mother was left alone in the dark until that fact registered with me, because prior to that, I had heard what she said, but I hadn't really listened, and I hadn't really understood. Now here in John 18, Pilate doesn't really understand what Jesus means either. Even though he hears some of what Jesus says, Pilate here doesn't really listen. When someone talks to us, we have the opportunity to follow the material presented. Now that's a phrase from pastoral care and from clinical pastoral education. Follow the material presented. It means to listen. It means to listen in order to be able to ask questions. It means to listen in order to understand. And that's a good thing to do whenever someone talks to us. We can follow the material presented, or we can take ourselves out of the conversation. And when we don't listen to somebody, that's what we do. We take ourselves out of the conversation rather than asking questions about what they say. Now, I've been trained in following the material presented, but it is something that I have not always done and don't always do. One time, when I was studying clinical pastoral care at the VA in Hampton, I had a patient, a hospice patient, and he was telling me about sitting on the porch one nice day, and seeing out there on the grounds in front of the hospice building, seeing a hawk with its dinner in its clutches. He said the hawk landed with his feast right before him, and he said the hawk took his time eating, or even preparing to eat, what he had caught, because he thought that the hawk really wanted everyone to see how dominant he was and how powerful he was, in that he had caught this animal and was about to eat it. Now, if I had followed the material presented, I would have asked the patient what was that like for him. He had used words like power and dominance and talked about seeing, the hawk make sure that everyone saw what was going on. I could have asked how that felt for him, but I didn't do that because I didn't follow the material presented. Instead of following the material presented, I just felt like I had to say something. So I launched into this windy and rather pointless soliloquy about seeing a coyote by the road once when I went for a run in Texas. And it was a shame that I did that, because instead of following the material presented, what I did was I took myself out of the conversation and started my own competing conversation. And to an extent, that's what Pilate does here as well. Pilate doesn't follow the material presented, and so he and Jesus more or less have competing conversations here. And 2 times Jesus has to skip back and answer Pilate's question before last, because they're not really communicating. And Pilate isn't seeking to understand what Jesus says. He's just asking his own questions. And that's a shame. That's a shame because, quite frankly, this is the last conversation that Jesus will ever have with anybody one-on-one before his crucifixion. And on top of that, it's a shame because Pilate here is invited to be part of Jesus' kingdom. And instead of hearing and understanding that opportunity and that invitation, Pilate takes himself out of the conversation and has his own competing conversation of his own. It's a shame, because Pilate could have listened and tried to understand, but instead Pilate takes himself out right at the beginning. Pilate doesn't answer Jesus' question in verse 34 about why Pilate asked Jesus if he is the king of the Jews. Where did that question come from? Instead, Pilate deflects what Jesus says there and asks Jesus a question of his own, saying, I am not a Jew, am I? And when Pilate does that, he lumps himself unknowingly right in with Jesus' enemies, who, like Pilate, had not heard what Jesus said. Or maybe they heard it. But they didn't want to listen. When we do that, when anyone does that, when we deflect what Jesus asks us, we miss out on an opportunity to be real with Jesus. And that's a shame. Because when we are real with Jesus, when we don't deflect and deny what he says, we hear him inviting us to be part of his kingdom rather than squandering that opportunity and that invitation. All of Jesus' enemies, including Pilate here, squander that opportunity and that invitation. And as Jesus says here, those who belong to the truth, who know the truth and hear the truth, listen to his voice and try to understand what he says. So let's be real, and let's listen to Jesus. Let's not just hear him the way that I heard my mother just heard her, or the way that Pilate just heard Jesus, the way that Jesus' enemies just heard him without really listening or seeking to understand. Let's be real, and let's listen to Jesus, and let's let him talk to us. You see, Jesus wants to speak to us. Jesus wants to tell us the truth. That's why he says that he came here. So let's let him speak, and let's hear what he says and what he wants to say, because he wants for us to hear the truth and not to deflect or to deny the things he says. One of the mistakes that Pilate makes here is Pilate starts talking about someone else rather than letting Jesus talk to him or letting himself be real with Jesus. When Jesus asked Pilate who was behind the question that Pilate asked, him or someone else, Pilate then, with his answer, which is actually a question, I'm not a Jew, am I? Pilate shifts Jesus' question from him to a different people altogether. Now, whenever Jesus talks to us, he doesn't ask us about a different people altogether. When Jesus talks to us, he asks us about ourselves, as when he asks his disciples, who do you say that I am? Or when he says to Pilate, are you asking me this question, or did someone else tell you what to ask me? When Jesus asks questions about us, Jesus gives us an opportunity to be real with him. He doesn't want to hear at that point who other people say that he is or what other people say about them. He wants to know who we are. He wants us to be real. He wants to invite us, all of us, even Pilate and his other enemies, into his kingdom. Jesus wants to do that, and Jesus wants to tell us the truth. And that's what those who belong to his kingdom do. Listen to the truth. It almost makes me wonder how silent, how quiet it must be in Jesus' kingdom as those who belong to him listen to the truth. And if it is silent, that's not a bad thing. That can even be a joyous thing. But if we're listening to the truth, it almost makes me wonder when we are supposed to witness ourselves, when we are supposed to witness to him. But maybe that's not the point. Maybe the point here is that when Jesus questions us, maybe what Jesus is giving us the opportunity to do is to be real with him and to be real with our answers. See, Jesus wants us to tell him who we are and what we need. He wants to know us so that he can be our king, and that means that we have to be real with him rather than trying to deflect his attention. When we are real with him and when we listen to the truth, then we belong to his kingdom. So may we be real with our King every time he gives us the opportunity. And may we hear what he says. Amen. Thanks be to God.